This is Theater Talk. I'm Susan Haskins. Anybody who cares anything about the musical theater must read Words with Music, Lehman Engel's classic book, which is filled with insight and wisdom and also some really crackpot ideas on top of it. But they're all pulled together. They're all pulled together in this update by one of our guests. And here to introduce both our guests is my co-host, Michael Riedel of the New York Post.
Not quite so crackpot as the commentary of this book by Howard Kissel, the drama critic of the New York Daily News, who has updated Lehman Engel's classic work, and we're happy to have Howard with us today. And we have one of Lehman Engel's students at the BMI workshop, which he founded, the lyricist Susan Birkenhead, lyricist of Jelly's Last Jam and the upcoming Flamenco Kid. Right. Welcome to Theater Talk.
Thank you.
All right, Howard, first tell us, who was Lehman Engel? I'm afraid he may have been lost in the mists of time to an extent.
He may have been. However, he was an extremely important figure on Broadway in the 30s, 40s, 50s, and 60s. He conducted many of the great Broadway musicals. I've always been impressed by the fact that he recorded the first complete version of Porgy and Bess in 1950 or 51, when it was mainly known as a musical. But he conducted the complete score, and then he founded the BMI workshop, where he taught many young people like Susan, like Maury Yeston, the principles of musical theater at a time when everything was sort of falling apart.
Right, right. And what was he like as a teacher? I mean, this is sort of an instruction manual, Words with Music, of how to write a Broadway musical. Is that what the class was like?
Exactly. Well, the first year was essentially that book. It was essentially, you know, how to. He was, for me, it just opened this incredible door to this whole world of writing for the theater. And because he had been in the pit for so many years and had seen musicals in development, he just knew. He was one of those people who simply got it. Right. And he was able to articulate it.
He understood the craftsmanship of creating a musical.
Exactly. And so it was someone who articulated something that I thought I knew instinctively. And for the first time, he actually put it into words, and I discovered that there was, in fact, a way to learn how to do this. That there were rules, that it was fine to break the rules eventually,
but you
that
had
if
to
you
know
knew the rules.
And what, Howard, as this book says, what are the rules? I mean, what are Lehman's rules of writing a musical, and do they still hold true today?
Well, he began sort of looking at character. I think one of the first chapters is about character. So the rules, as far as he was concerned, it was not just about writing musicals, it was about writing plays, because there was a time when musicals were thought to be plays with music. And that's why the rules that he gives you in the early chapters, they're rules that you might have found in a book about playwriting. But music amplifies the points that the play makes.
So when you say character, what does he mean by character? What was he impressing on you about character, the importance of character?
Well, that everything comes from character. I mean, comedy comes from character. If it's not, you know, if it's not rooted in reality, in situation and in character, it's not really funny. It's a string of gags. And because there was so much emphasis on character. I mean, it's the basic rules of drama, really. And so that writing a lyric is almost like preparing a scene. It's like an actor preparing a scene. You crawl inside the character's head. You think, you know, what is the first logical sound to come out of this character's mouth within the context of telling this story, and you write the lyric. And
one of his other rules, I think, is particularization, I think is the phrase he uses, about meaning that the lyrics especially have to be very, very specific.
Specific.
Yeah.
Again, it stems from the character. One character might say such a thing. I mean, very often in musical theater, they're all saying, I love you. But the way one character says, I love you, is very different from the way another character
And he has an
says
example of songs, love songs, where the word love is never used. Which
Well,
is that must have been one of his favorite
It was
little
one of his
teaching
exercises,
tricks.
yes.
And you had to write songs for him, a love song, without using the word
Exactly.
love?
Exactly.
What did you write for him? Do you remember?
You know, I can't remember. I remember he had specific exercises in the first year. Everyone had to write a ballad, and the exercise he chose was a scene from A Streetcar Named Desire, a ballad for Blanche. So everybody had a Blanche song.
My goodness.
But what a great exercise.
Yeah.
It was, and you know, that was the first exercise, and that really taught me how to write for character with specificity. The trouble is, what I wrote was not a ballad.
What did you write him?
But he loved
tempo
it.
comedy song for Blanche?
Did you do the music too,
wasn't.
Susan?
I did. My dirty little secret is that I came into the workshop as a composer and lyricist because I couldn't find anybody who wrote lyrics I liked. And so I was both
You
composer
tried with
and
Steve Sondheim.
lyricist.
You wasn't that great.
Yeah,
so you did now, another one of his rules is comedy. I mean, he emphasizes that it's musical comedy, and that comedy has got to be a part of even dramatic musicals as a kind of release from the drama.
Yes.
Yet it seems in this age today we have musicals where there is no comedy. I mean, Michael John LaCusa's musicals, House of Bernarda Alba, there's not a lot of laughs in that. We've moved away from this rule, have we not, Howard?
We have moved away.
To our detriment?
I was going to say, has it necessarily made the musical theater better? Perhaps that's not a question we should discuss.
No,
at this
has it?
time.
Yeah, you're a
well,
critic.
again, we have, after all, what's interesting is the theater in which Lehman Engel worked was a commercial theater. He went from show to show, and it's amazing when you look back at the 50s and even the beginning of the 60s, how many shows there were.
Yeah.
And they were, I'm afraid, commodities. They were sort of prepared, they were honed in hopes of having a long life. Now, most of our musicals come from not-for-profit theaters. And I'm afraid some of those not-for-profit theaters have highfalutin ideas of what a musical should be. Perhaps it should be closer to opera. As a result, the musicals that they turn out often, not always, but often, do not have the long life that a lot of the shows that Lehman Engel worked on.
There's still a lot of honed ones left, Howard. I mean, there's a lot of bad honing going on
yes,
of a product for Broadway
yes.
nowadays.
And I mean, it's a different world than it was then. I mean, a point that I always make is that in those days, theater music and American popular music were the same thing.
Right.
Yes.
So that when a composer started to write, the idiom was not something that he had to create. Whereas now, popular music is over here, and theater music is over here. There's very little conversion.
But I'm talking about the honing for Broadway. And Lehman says, I believe there's nothing more frustrating for an artist than the unlimited opportunity for expression. And I'm thinking of how nowadays you have artists on Broadway, mostly young, who will hit it with something that came from their gut, that they worked years to make. And then the producers come and throw all kinds of money at them and say, you can write whatever you want. And then for the years after in these artists' careers, they're writing very mediocre stuff.
Who do you have in mind?
I
You
was
wanna
just
name
going to
someone?
ask who.
Well, I can't.
Afraid
I'm
to
too
name
gutless
names?
to name names. But
Well, who?
Oh,
but we're thinking of a lot of playwrights or librettists. There's a handful of them who have one big hit, or which means it was celebrated by the New York Times, and now they have development deals. Artists are kind of ruined by the honing process.
Well, doesn't this go to the point of Lehman Engel's
Yes,
book, that
well,
you've got to learn the rules to do it?
Exactly. I think that's why I brought it up.
Exactly.
Yeah.
You got to
I hope we have that on
I hope we have that on tape. All right.
I want to, after that interlude,
Oh, did I bring up the point?
I wanted to bring
I'm
it.
so sorry.
I
All
want to
right.
bring it back though to this notion of the music of the pop culture and the music of the theater being apart. At a time when you were studying with Lehman Engel, rock music was really kind of taking over Broadway, and he seems to be very concerned about its influence on Broadway. Did you get a sense as a young person with him that he was just kind of out of touch about rock music? Did you have a sense that rock music could be used in the theater?
I think that Lehman sort of lumped all rock music together. Lehman, first of all, Lehman believed that the music should be timeless, that and should not be, you know, specific to, if you were writing a musical about China, you shouldn't write music that sounded like Chinese music.
It should be China by way of Broadway.
That you should write in your own voice, and that it should be specific to character, and it should work dramatically, but not be nailed down. But I think what he didn't understand was that you could take rock or jazz
or Chinese music and theatricalize it, that it was possible to adapt it so that it would work in a theatrical context. And I think some people have done it successfully and some haven't.
Well, Stephen Schwartz, at the time, in 1970 when the book came out, was writing pop rock kind of scores that I think actually scores that are quite good. Godspell and Pippin, for example.
And Pippin, and it holds up. My sort of reservation is that rock was essentially the music of teenagers.
Yes.
And that's why it is not a universal idiom. And that's why you could do rock for Grease, you could do rock for Godspell, which is a kind of adolescent version of the Bible. But would rock work for, say, My Fair Lady? No. Would rock work for Fiddler on the Roof? No.
No.
So it was not a universal idiom. And that's why I think and I'm sure that he, being a man set in his ways by the time rock emerged, did not find it an appetizing prospect.
Yes, as you say, he devotes more pages to lacerating hair than talking about practically any other show in the book.
I know, but that's because at the time, hair, which now is thought of as a kind of relic, a period piece, but at the time, and it's true in the theater, because this is, even at the time that he wrote it, it was a troubled period in the theater. In the early 70s, 2/3 of Broadway theaters were dark. And I think he saw one of the villains as rock. And that's why he was writing this book, to say, we can come back. But at the same time that he was doing that, there were many voices in the theater saying, we've got to harness the energy of rock.
Also, it was what I was so insightfully talking about before, that once Rado and Ragni did Hair, then, everybody gave them huge musical deals. And here were these guys, had talented, but they kind of lucked out in this phenomenon. And then there were, what, 5 flop musicals that grew out of that creative team's efforts and the honing they did with them.
Well, but again, what kind of honing could you do with
hair?
That's right. Well, you gave them a bunch of money and said, do it again. And they were, huh?
And he was appalled by this.
Galt McDermott is quite a good composer.
Yes, he's pulled out,
really good.
When you read this book, it's the tone of it is fascinating, because there's a kind of, there's great insight in it, but there's a kind of fussiness.
Yeah.
There's a fuddy-duddy quality.
That's what
was
I meant
he
by
like that
crackpot.
as a human being dealing with him?
He was a little bit fussy.
I mean, you get the sense that he's, always well turned out in a suit.
He was a Southern boy,
Yes,
which I think had something to do with it, at a time when the South did have a more sort of old-fashioned mentality.
Yes.
Then he was like that, you said?
And he was. He was given to, he was a bit of a dandy. He would wear very sort of fancy shirts and ties, and he was meticulous in everything that he did.
But that's but also he had been brought up in a much more straight-laced time. And again, in the early 70s, 71 or 2, when this book was published, it must have seemed to him that everything he knew and loved was falling apart.
This is why your commentary is so important in the book. After every chapter, Howard's written commentary about the thing. 2 of the things he was really stuck on that I thought were odd. One was that the musical was less if it didn't have some kind of, moon, June, boy-girl romantic element. And secondly, he felt a good musical must have a subplot. And to me, often the subplot is the fat that should be trimmed away in some musicals. For instance, he thought that Cabaret was a bit of a failure because it had,
It's funny, he didn't fully appreciate that show. I can't figure out why.
He didn't even write about Gypsy, which is, to me, the most succinct,
Right.
libretto of a musical ever written.
He thought Gypsy was quite wonderful.
Oh, he doesn't put that across.
He
yeah.
doesn't, no.
But he put that across to you. We're talking
did,
about
yeah,
it.
Yeah, he thought it was, you know, a sort of a masterpiece.
It didn't meet his rules.
It didn't
Yeah.
meet his
Right.
rules.
But
you know.
again, he was thinking in terms of the theater, where even in non-musical plays, a subplot was often there to amplify the main plot. Remember, I mean, sometimes when you go to see an old play by Shaw or Ibsen, they're 4 acts. Sometimes they're 5 acts. That was an evening in the theater. I suspect a lot of people who grew up at that time, they come to see a play, even a wonderful play like Doubt, it's over in 90 minutes, no intermission. They would be kind of mystified.
Well, people like that today, Howard, because you get home early.
Yes, but also
dinner at a reasonable
he
hour.
does
It's not
an
a problem.
incredible amount in 90 minutes.
Yes.
But we also know there are plays that last 90 minutes in which nothing goes on.
Now, to be fair to Lehman Engel, though, before we dismiss him as a fuddy-duddy, he does recognize, for example, Company as a great
Yes, he
musical,
does.
which
Yes,
is
he does.
breaking the rules,
Yeah.
but it's written by somebody, Steve Sondheim, who mastered the rules. And that
Yes.
seems to me his, you know, the big point about
The thing is, he cared very much about language. He cared very much about dramatic structure. I mean, Lehman was the one, for instance, when he taught the comedy song, and you quote, or he quotes Walter Kerr in the book, that
Probably
most
he
comedy
does.
comes from tragedy.
Yeah, he quotes Walter Kerr, famous
yeah.
Walter Kerr line. Yeah.
Our comedy song assignment was a song from Come Back Little Sheba.
Oh,
Because he used to say life itself is messy, life is tragic, and life is funny. And you have to find, you know, the comedy in this moment. And it was a great exercise.
Again,
Do you remember?
Laugh.
I have an idea for a BMI fundraiser. All of you who
Oh,
are
yeah.
students, you should do your Blanche ballad.
That's a
I think that's a
Yes.
great
Come back,
idea,
little
Michael.
how about for a theater talk fundraiser?
But also, what's interesting about this is he was writing at a time when adults were the subject of plays and musicals. That is often not the case today.
Now it's singing forks and teacups.
It's all kinds of things, but it's not. After all, Come Back Little Sheba is about adults. Streetcar Named Desire is about adults. A lot of our theater is not. A lot of our theater nowadays is cartoons. And the thing about cartoons can be funny. I am very fond of Annie. But there was actually a human reality to Annie. It was about an orphan. It's funny, a friend recently gave me this Harry Connick album where he sings Maybe. To me, Maybe is one of the great songs of the musical theater. And Harry Connick gets the yearning of that child to meet the parents who sort of left him on a doorstep.
Because of its specificity, it is a universal.
Right.
And he
song.
talks a lot about that.
And that's the secret.
Right.
That's the secret. That's why Fiddler on the Roof is popular all over the world.
So really, to illustrate this, I mean, the lyrics of this song, maybe far away, maybe in a house somewhere by a hill, she's imagining what Annie is imagining, the house that her parents are living in, and it's very specific, and that is a key to, he says, and you know from doing yourself, to writing good lyrics.
Yes. Anyone, you know, anyone and everyone has experienced loss. And thinking, oh my God, maybe I'll find this person again someday.
Right.
And so everybody can feel what Annie is feeling at that moment, and that's why it works. And in the opening, you know, number, practically,
It
of
is, I
that
think,
show, you
yeah.
start weeping.
Right.
Exactly.
His mind ranges, though, far beyond just musical theater. I mean, he's a man who's steeped in Greek, the great Greek playwrights, and Shakespeare is very, very important to him.
Yes.
And he makes the point that the closest playwright to being the closest playwright to being a librettist is Shakespeare. Can you explain that and what his thinking was there?
No.
Howard, can you?
Well, when after all, the reason that Shakespeare still, when it works, when it is done well, it still thrills us. It's universal.
Yes.
But also, there's a famous essay by Prokofiev talking about montage in the cinema and comparing it to, interestingly, Shakespeare and Dickens. And it is the alternation of the serious and the comic. to play off one another. But yes, Shakespeare, well, to begin with, Shakespeare wrote largely in verse.
Right.
So I think part of the reason that a lot of our actors can't do Shakespeare is they don't have any musicality. They don't know how to handle verse. So there is a musical component.
And he points out that Shakespeare also was one of the first librettists and that he brought songs into his plays
Oh,
and wrote
the
the
plays are
lyrics.
full of songs.
There's a wonderful section of the book here where he compares the libretto scene by scene of Romeo and Juliet
To West Side
and
Story.
West Side Story. And I mean, obviously we all know the adaptation, but when you see how closely
It tracks,
it
yeah.
tracks, it's absolutely fascinating.
Well, I think one of the things he's talking about technically with Shakespeare is that there is this great narrative drive and momentum in Shakespeare. Every scene ends with a character saying, and then I'm going to do this next scene.
Yeah.
And one of the points he says, a musical must be swift, must always be, pushing the narrative along.
Shakespeare wrote about huge subjects,
Right.
large subjects. And Lehman used to say, you must write, about an outsized character with huge problems, with
Right,
something.
but again, there was a time when that was the theater. It was not necessarily the kitchen sink.
Yeah.
It was all situations that were, again, Uta Hagen is famous for saying she was criticizing a scene and the actor said, "You mean you want it to be larger than life?" And Uta Hagen says, "Nothing is larger than life." Very often when we go to the theater today, we don't have that impression.
Yeah,
it's
very
smaller
true.
than life.
Yeah.
But Lehman Engel grew up at a time when it was assumed
Yeah.
that the theater had to be as large as life. Not larger, because nothing is larger, but it had to be as large. And after all, music opens everything up.
Right.
Yes, it does.
You can, I'm trying to think of an example. Well, he was very conversant with opera. Here is an example. More often than not, when you see Shakespeare's Othello, you're bored because it's a very, very hard play to do. I don't think anyone is ever bored when they see Verdi's Othello because he has condensed everything. He's made it as intense as possible. Again, his librettist, Boito, did a brilliant job of carving away anything that in Shakespeare, everything matters. But if you carve what he carved away, it's even leaner, it's even tauter, it's even more compelling. And that's, I think, what the theater should be. Again, we have accepted a kind of triviality as part of our theater. That's
why I was so surprised the fixation was subplot, actually adding more fat, and also that he feels that it's so important to have this boy-girl romance stuff, this old style, very dated kind of
what's wrong with romance in music?
I think it didn't have to be necessarily boy-girl romance. He just wanted an element of romance.
He wanted an element of romance, but what's funny is at a certain point, he doesn't like the idea of middle-aged romance.
That's right, and he doesn't like middle-aged characters.
Yes,
it's very strange.
That is just bizarre.
And yet, Susan, Company, there's not a lot of romance in Company, is one of the shows that Lehman Engel praises. So
that even
live
though
by Lehman's rules until you come up with a better show that breaks them, and then he
to his great credit, he may have set down these rules, but he didn't necessarily feel that everything had to fit those rules.
Again, back to my ballad that was not a ballad. The first thing he said when I finished playing it was, "That is not a ballad." And I was crushed, and then he said, "But it's wonderful." And and he was able to see beyond that, and it wasn't wonderful. It was my first attempt at that, but because it was character specific and because it evoked the character, he was able to say, "Okay, so you didn't, it wasn't slow, and it didn't do this, and it wasn't music driven, but fine."
This is what it did do. That was correct.
Yeah,
that he was flexible.
He was able to see
beyond his own rules.
Yeah. Well, it's a fascinating book, Words with Music, a classic. Thank you for bringing it back to us, Howard, with your own never crackpot, sometimes funny commentary when you say, "Young people today." I love the sound of your voice. I hear it throughout the book.
I love what he did.
That's great. And one of his star pupils, Susan Birkenhead. Thank you for being our guest tonight on Theater Talk.
So we're going to close now with the fabulous Harry Connick Jr. not singing Maybe, but singing Hernando's Hideaway from Pajama Game.